Okay, welcome to Vanessa. Vanessa will be giving us an introduction to the research software engineer movement. Over to you.
Alrighty, I guess I'll take it away from here then. Hi everyone, I am Vanessa Sockett. I am a computer scientist / research software engineer at Lawrence Livermore National Lab. And I'm here to give you kind of a different kind of talk. I want to tell you a story of the research software engineer movement. And so the talk is going to have 5 parts today. We're going to start out with a high-level overview of the RSE movement. Then we're going to kind of step back and say, okay, what the heck is a research software engineer? We're going to talk about problems that still remain in our community, how you can help, probably the most important part of the talk. And then we're going to finish up with what do we want for the future. So let's get started. Once upon a time, there was a thriving savanna filled with researchers, and the rule of the land was publish or perish, because you could be the strongest, most impressive PI, but you still had the weight of the world on your shoulders. And the reason was because not only did you need to be an expert in your domain science, because of the importance of software and research, you also needed to have mad skills as a software engineer. And so if you've lived during this time, over the years, you've probably noticed this dark cloud moving over the savanna. And the reason is because it's just too much burden for one researcher to have. But thankfully, wise elders in our community have been looking out for us. And specifically in 2010, in the International Conference on Global Software Engineering, they wrote this paper, this empirical study, and they not only looked at software and testing and that kind of thing, but they also said, you know, we think there's this idea of research software engineering. And no, it's not this single proof of concept, one-off idea. It's this idea that is global. It is for highly distributed collaborative projects. It is important. And so arguably in 2010, this was the first time that we have a record, that I could find, that we have a record of the term research software engineering in a publication. And this was the dawn of a new era, because although computing has been around a long time and been used in research, this was really the first time that someone sort of pointed it out very abruptly. So we continue our story. It was a beautiful sunny day in March of 2012, and a small group met at the Queen's College, Oxford. There it is. It's quite a beautiful building. I've never been there myself. And so they met for CW12, the collaborations workshop in 2012. And they had one question on their mind. Why the heck is there no career for software developers in academia? Like, hey, we know that software is important. Where's the career path? And so they had the meeting, and afterwards, as you do, you make a Google group. And so they reviewed the 5 most important things that they learned during the discussion. The first, they said, you know what? We need a label. We're going to call it research software engineer. And of course, I wasn't there. I don't know if they read that paper from 2010, if there's a connection, but this is really kind of the first time that research software engineer was coined. They also said, we are eventually going to need a professional body. We are going to need certification and training and education. And finally, we are really wanting recognition. We want to be recognized as an important part of this academic fabric. And so in 2012, this was arguably kind of the start of the movement in the UK. And if you were sort of like around during this time, you were sort of having this like epiphany, like, I'm a research software engineer. And so they continued talking about it. So this was a paper from Digital Research in 2012. And this did talk about sort of the role, but it went into the career path. And specifically it said, you know, we have, with our software engineers in the commercial sector, why are we so far behind the commercial sector? And why is it that our tools, they kind of like only exist for the life cycle of a project and then nobody knows? And why is it that our development techniques are so ad hoc and we don't have sort of formal training? And finally, the institutions realize the opportunity cost of not like paying attention to us. And so there's a lot of conversation going on. Everyone was talking about it. And so they kind of wanted to talk about it more. So this led to the first UK RSE workshop. And so I was scooping around online and I found the schedule for this. And this is really interesting to look at because a lot of the topics that they were discussing back then are still sort of really big now. So cloud versus HPC. Have you heard any people arguing about this recently? And then collaboration. How the heck do you share code? How do we work together? This is like not a trivial thing. Legacy code, that old Fortran treasure from 20 years ago, what the heck do we do with it? And then finally, a lot of questions about community, culture, and these are still things that we talk about a lot today. And so in 2013, this was the first UK RSE workshop. And just notice like how far we're getting in just a couple of years. Alrighty, so what do you do? Did I skip a slide? No, I didn't. So what do you do right after that? Well, you need a society. Hold on, I think I skipped a slide. I guess not. Okay, so right after that, they said, you know, we need a society. And so they started the Society of Research Software Engineering, as they alluded to a couple of years earlier. And so now in 2014, we've gone just a couple of years and we have like an official professional organization, which is super cool. Alrighty, so what the heck comes after society? Well, groups, of course, but as Argonne here is giving us this window, one does not simply start an RSE group. This is an incredibly challenging thing. Like, where's the money going to come from in terms of how you're going to hire people, how you're going to find the people, where are they going to sit at the university? It's just a super challenging thing that someone needs to take on, but they did. And so the first one that did it was James Hetherington at the University College of London, followed shortly by Robert Haynes at the University of Manchester, and then Mike Crutcher and Paul Richmond at the University of Sheffield, Christopher Woods at the University of Bristol, and Simon Hetrick and John Robinson, not pictured, I could not find a picture of him, at the University of Southampton. So I kind of threw up these slides and I was like, yeah, there's a group over here and over here. But again, starting a group is a non-trivial thing, and all of these different groups have stories. So I encourage you to search for them on YouTube and to watch their talks and to listen to their story to hear about how it happened. Alrighty, so we're into 2015. We have groups in the UK. Yes. So after that, of course, they kind of wanted to like compare notes, like, hey, how you doing over there? What's not working for you? What's working for you? So they came up with these RSE leaders meetings to just meet a couple times a year and do exactly that. This led to the RSE Leaders Network, and also in 2015. But like, is it like only the case that there's RSEs in the UK? Because I kind of think they're in the rest of the world too. Of course they are, and I suspect this was on their mind at that time. And so they had a bigger vision for research software engineering. And so in 2016, they had the first sort of global conference on research software engineering in September. So this was a really big marker, because if we scoot down our timeline a little bit, this led to groups being established in Germany and then also in Australia and New Zealand. And then, of course, you know, the UK Leaders Workshop, like it wasn't big enough, so they expanded it to the International Leaders Workshop, bringing people from the United States and, of course, the UK and all the way over in New Zealand. And this was really awesome. So 2019, finally, my country got on board and we started the US RSE, the US Research Software Engineer Association. And then by 2022, I can't believe we're in 2022, we have over 30 groups in the UK, and I suspect that there's going to be more groups just sort of blowing up everywhere. So I wanted to do this slide to kind of give you a glance at just some like the prominent logos. One thing we've done really well as an international community is just having like a common, consistent branding. We really are working together in this movement. And so this was also just kind of like a high level story, because remember, like I was not there. I am doing as you would do. I'm reading the internets to find all this information, but hopefully this gives you kind of like a high level idea of how we've got to where we are today. So if I had to summarize it, I would say, okay, 2010 is the first time we saw the term research software engineering. 2012 is when it took off in the UK. And then in 2016, with that first conference, that is when it sort of took off globally. Alrighty, so I know. Some of you are probably sitting in the audience like scratching your head like, come on, Vanessa, you haven't told me what is an RSE. Let's get to that. So if you saw someone give a talk in maybe the past decade about this, they would present this time like they'd say, a research software engineer is someone that is on the dimension between software engineering and research. Maybe you're here in the middle, maybe you're more researcher, maybe you're a research developer. But I kind of looked at this and I scratched my head a little bit and I was like, well, okay, I kind of see that you could say an RSE is like between programmer and researcher. But, you know, I've also seen like web developers that consider themselves RSE system administrators, people that actually maybe do like work on a farm or some kind of student, someone that provides user support or kind of librarian, a manager or a data scientist. So the problem with this definition is that someone might look at it and say, you know, I really thought I was an RSE, but like I don't belong on this single dimension. And so I had this question in 2019, how can we actually hear RSE stories? Because people in positions of power were giving these talks about this very limited definition, and it was possibly, you know, scaring people away. So my first idea was, well, let's make a YouTube video. So I made the story of the research software engineer, the little hammer that could, and you know, that it only went so far. It's a YouTube video. But I woke up one morning in September and I had this terrible idea. I was like, you know what? I am going to start a podcast. Yes, I'm going to start a podcast and I'm going to invite people that are RSEs onto the podcast. And I'm just going to have them explicitly tell their story, because what better way to get it out there than that? And of course, this was a terrible idea because I'm actually kind of introverted. So the idea of like talking to people regularly was terrifying, but I knew it was important and needed to be done. And about a year later, this is Peter Schmidt. Peter sent me an email and he's like, hey, Vanessa, you know, I just started my new role in the UK and I would love to be your co-host. And I said, Peter, I would love to have you. So Peter was a co-host for about a year. And then he mustered up the courage to actually start his own podcast. So now we have multiple podcasts in the RSE world. And this is really a testament to kind of the growth and like the energy of our community. Speaking of growth, I wanted to kind of show you this quick plot. So many of our different sort of country organizations, we keep track of how many members we have. So this is for US RSE. It's a plot that's updated on our website. And you can see our growth is very consistent. So as of December 2021, we were sort of just under 1,000 and we're just keep going. And it really tells you like the RSEs are out there. We're just finding them. Alrighty, so what the heck does an RSE do? Maybe some of you have this question. So one of the working groups in US RSE, it's the Training and Education Working Group, we are trying to kind of start to tackle this question because logically this is going to lead to training and education materials. And so we came up with this list, kind of high level categories, everything from like software development, UI, you know, domain specific stuff, all the way down to kind of people related and open source stuff. And I'm not going to show you this whole list, but if you were to expand it out, it has like 120 topics. And there's probably some of you in like the audience being like, whoa, that's like everything but the kitchen sink. That is just like too many things to do. No single person can possibly do all that. And I kind of agree. So what I did is I tried to come up with kind of a high level description of what are the different types of RSEs. So the first type that I've seen is kind of service oriented. So maybe you're sitting within a lab or a group like research computing, and the idea is that you're providing really a service for researchers. Either it's for your lab or people are coming to you and they're being like, can I make this script faster? The second kind is sort of development oriented. So you may already be sitting in a community and you kind of understand the needs of the community and you're working on some specific software for that community. And it's sort of less of a service oriented thing, but you might be, for example, answering issues on GitHub. And the third, I didn't really get a sense of until I came to the National Lab. The third is research oriented, and that means that you're doing sort of research on fundamental models or algorithms that have to do with software. Alrighty, and so there's kind of, you know, a research software engineer is like a Tootsie Pop, no, or like an apple. We sort of have this core set of things that we do, but I would say that there's also different flavors of RSE. So I just want to quickly show you this. These are kind of the different flavors that I've seen around. Alrighty, so that is a very high level of what is a research software engineer. The reason I can't do better than that is because there really isn't sort of a very clean answer. You know, we have all these definitions like this. So let's move now into what problems still remain. Now, I'm going to give you kind of the problems that I think are most important, that I think if we solve, we'll kind of trickle down and solve a lot of smaller problems. So, did anyone notice at the beginning of this talk, I introduced myself as a computer scientist / research software engineer? Well, disappointosaurus, my title is just computer scientist. And this is actually a pretty regular thing when you work with research software, that your title is usually something else. So I can show you my titles from, you know, maybe the last decade or so. And despite the fact that I've always been working on research software, and I've been like a research assistant, a research technician 2.5, and it doesn't really acknowledge what I'm actually doing. And actually, this is a well-known problem. So they did a study in the UK. They looked at 10,000 different job advertisements. And of those 10,000, they found 400 that were related to research software. Of those 400, there were almost 200 different job titles. Let that sink in. You have all these people that are sort of in this common community, but we're all labeled something else. And so this describes the PERS problem perfectly. There is not recognition or formal structure for our role. As another example, let's say that you're a student and you're graduating from college and you're like, I want to go to graduate school. And so you go to graduate school and you like study all the things. And then you look ahead at the path that you are supposed to follow. And it's like, become a postdoc. Then maybe if you're lucky, become an assistant professor. And then if you're like this 2 to 3% of really lucky people, you become this acclaimed principal investigator. But hold on, rewind. Like, what if you don't want that? What if you kind of say, you know, I want to be in this research community, but I don't want to do that path. Well, you feel like this. You feel like this one of these things that isn't like the other. Oh my gosh, I'm an imposter. They think I want to be academic to be a PI, but I really just want to like build servers and stuff. And so you become a research associate too. And then you have no job progression beyond that because research associate 2 there is no research associate 3. But could we imagine a world where in graduate school, maybe you study biology or something, and then you have a concentration in research software engineering, and you become an RSE, and there's actually like a career path for you. So this is the second problem. There isn't training or a stable career path. And I kind of think that these two problems, you know, there are a lot of other problems, don't get me wrong, but I think with these two problems, if we were able to solve these, a lot of the other problems would sort of just trickle down and be solved, because if we have this really great like layer of RSEs across academia, national labs, et cetera, we would be able to do some pretty cool things together. Alrighty, so those are the main two problems I think still remain. So now the most important part of the talk, how can you help? Because nothing is more frustrating when someone is giving a talk and they're like, oh, these problems and these terrible things, and you're like, oh my goodness, I just don't know how to help. I'm gonna tell you how to do that. All right, so let's start with easy ways that you can help. The first thing that you can do is to engage with your local research software engineer community. So this means, you know, go on the website, check it out. What events are going on? Is there something you want to be a fly on the wall for? Join us on Slack. The main Slacks I'm a part of, there's a society Slack and then there's USRC Slack. Most of us are on both because we like having lots of friends. If you're still kind of chewing on this, not really understanding like what the heck is an RSE, I recommend that you look at job boards to see what people are actually looking for. So this is the USRC job board. And actually, if you scroll down, which I cannot do, it's a slide, you'll find that there's links to other job boards there. You can also participate in other ways. So for example, every year we have this big survey. And we don't just want to hear from people that identify as RSEs. We want to hear from lots of different people. And also, I don't know if you, some of you are on that Twitter place. We have lots of handles on that Twitter place. So that's another place that you can interact with our communities. So another thing you can do to help is to find RSEs at your institution and talk to them. And other than kind of learning about the role, you know, you can say, hey, how are you feeling? How do you feel about your career path? How can I help? Minimally, if you do nothing, just talking to someone and acknowledging them and saying like, I see you, I value what you do, that is a huge benefit for mental health. Next easy thing you can do is to give credit to your research software engineer. So if there's someone that is working on software in your lab and normally you wouldn't put them on a paper, put them on your papers. So unfortunately, because we're sort of in this academic fabric, our value and worth is still heavily based on publication. And so, you know, sometimes we need a little help. We shouldn't be put in the acknowledgement section. We should be put on papers. If the software doesn't get enough sort of highlighting in the paper, I would encourage them to publish in a journal like JOSS, the Journal of Open Source Software. And the reason is because you can literally like type up a paper in like an hour and then get a DOI for it and sort of help with your career. Oh, but then I want to help with all the things. Okay, so if you're like a super motivated person and just like talking to people and just joining a Slack isn't enough for you, here are some more involved ways that you can help. So the first is to talk to people with influence. So let's say you have a meeting with a high-level person in your department, in your school, be like, you know, research software is so important to what we do. look, it drove these papers and these publications that made us look really good. And have you heard of this research software engineer movement thing? Like, are we doing anything about that? You know, FOMO, fear of missing out, is a huge deal with some of these universities. You can also write the needs for software and people to work on software into your proposals. Help them to be a part of that traditional academic fabric by setting aside that money. And now, I'm not saying to start a group, but maybe just think about, look around you, see how the structure of your university is, and say, like, what would it actually take to start a group? And one thing I've actually seen work really well, so let's say that you're in a small lab and you don't have enough money to like hire a full person, you could talk to other labs in your department and then kind of pool your money and then maybe hire the first RSE that can be shared between those departments. Alrighty, so to appeal to some folks in the audience that need a different kind of motivation, what happens if you don't? Well, if you have bad software, you might have papers rejected. And this really does happen. Here's sort of a prime example, 5 retractions for 1 bad piece of software. You do not want this to be you, folks. On the flip side, you could just have more papers accepted. That would be equally fantastic. Now, if your papers are kind of bad, you may slow down your career progression, and maybe you're like a sloth and you're like, this is fine, I'm good, I'm like cruising, but you know, I don't think it really is. If you're one of those people that's like, we used homegrown lab scripts, lots of spaghetti code, and you know, this kind of work can't really be easily extended. And I don't think people want to extend it, so don't do that. And finally, like if you're this kind of person that you know has this culture like, oh, I'm not going to share my code, and you know, if I did share it, it's spaghetti anyway, like the culture is really shifting to be the opposite of that, to be open and sharing code. And so you're going to have a hard time finding collaborators and also finding funding. Oh, but Vanessa, I don't need any help. I got this covered. I'm fine. Okay. But let me give you some signs in the wild that you need an RSE. The first is that you don't have a strategy for storing or moving data. Just put it in Scratch, John, in the graveyard with all the other data sets passed that are going to get purged in 90 days. You don't share any of your code on GitHub because, oh, I don't want to get scooped. I'm just going to sit here on my own private island and just worry about that. You get feedback in a paper that your methods aren't clear and you can't remember how you actually did it. Someone tries your software and it's like a struggle bus. You go back and forth for a week, them like sending you like terminal output with errors, and you're just like, why is this my life? You don't have a plan for testing, portability, or validation. Oh yeah, John, the plan is, there's no plan. We'll just like figure it out as we go. And maybe your code isn't optimized and it's like really, really slow. So you go have like a sword fight or something. And actually this just happened this week, so I wanted to share it. But at the University of Bristol, they had a script that took 10 days to run. Like literally let it run and go off like for 10 days, have a vacation. And they got it down to 34 seconds. That is sort of the value, one example of the value of an RSE. Alrighty, so that's kind of a little bit how you can help, a little bit of fear mongering. I think we needed both. Now let's talk about what do we want for the future. And again, this is sort of my perspective. I definitely recommend that you talk to others to get their perspective. The first thing that we want is a stable job not funded by soft money. Yes, we want job security. So I actually left my last position because I would lie awake at night worrying, am I going to have a job like during the pandemic? Am I getting enough projects to support my role? And that is like super stressful for your mental health. We also want formal training and certification. So we want it to be the fact that like there's a path for you and you don't just sort of stumble along and like carve your own path. We also want a collaborative fabric. So can you imagine if there's RSEs at every institution, national lab, and kind of international, we can kind of reach out and connect and better kind of understand like, oh, my lab was going to start that niche project, but it looks like someone over there is starting it. So we can, instead of making another niche project, we can actually work together. We want competitive salaries and career advancement. We don't want to be the research associate too and then just like die that way. And finally, I added this because I think it's really important. National labs set the example a lot, at least in the United States. I'm actually not familiar with other countries. So it's really important that they acknowledge the RSE role and also work to support it. And I suspect that if we had this layer of RSEs, we're going to have a really thriving open source community around that, more so than we have now. And finally, our community is, still needs to think about diversity, equity, and inclusion. Just like tech, we have these problems where it's primarily one demographic. And oh my goodness, folks, I do not want to publish or perish. I do not want that to be the way that I am determined to be valued. I want to see this landscape where I can help you, or let me speak more generally. As research software engineers, we want to enter this landscape and we want to remove that burden from your back to help with software engineering and to make better software and science together. So I'm going to leave you with one question. Given that better software will help your research, how do you want to help? So thanks, everyone. I'm VSOC on Twitter and GitHub, and I have to show this slide from my employer. Are there any questions?
I believe thank you to Vanessa, and I believe Kenneth has a question, so we'll go to him first.
Yeah, I posted this in Slack as well. Are you aware of any documentation for RSEs or written by RSEs that talk about packaging software? So what are the good practices? What are the things you definitely don't do? Like, for example, just earlier today, we again ran into an issue where somebody did the drop-in replacement of a released source tarball for something that had a version already. So they just swapped in a new version, then the checksum changed, and all our stuff broke because of that. So that's definitely a don't. But are you aware of docs like this or something we can contribute to?
Kenneth, are you trying to make package managers cry again? So definitely yes. I can speak for USRSE. So we have we're putting together resources along in that education and training group. We have like a huge list of resources. And I suspect one of them there is around that kind of topic. I think that if you're looking for like the master RSE documentation base that has rules for all the things, you're not going to find that. I think I'd like to see that in the next, maybe 5 years or so, hopefully not 10 years, that my thinking is that it's going to come along with when we really create kind of like a curriculum for what it means to be an RSE, then it's going to be very easy to match documentation for that, have an official thing, and then have an official place. So right now you can find them kind of sporadically. You'll have to search, and hopefully in a couple of years, you'll find more of a, this is the way.
That sounds great. And maybe another question as well. You showed that the UK has a very long history in RSEs. They basically started the thing, right? There was an example pretty early in the COVID pandemic where some people were doing modeling of the pandemic, and I think one researcher, or maybe RSE even, got hit pretty hard because once his code got public, people found pretty big issues in it and the way it was written and stuff like that. And I was a bit surprised by that, by the nation that started RSEs, right? So how is something like this still possible if the movement has been there for a decade and then we're still hitting issues like this?
Yeah, so I think there's still a lot of hesitancy to share code. And I think probably what would need to happen, what I do for my projects at least, is I put them out there immediately when they're new. And I try to get, if you think of the cathedral and the bazaar, the more eyes that you can get on something, the better. And so I don't think that, by way of having the movement, that makes people immune to not, putting up their code at like the last minute or not having enough people look over it. That's probably a reflection that I don't know that particular study or the researcher or how it happened, but I would suspect that person didn't put their code up soon enough and didn't have enough people looking at it before they published. And if it was peer reviewed, that possibly reflects that they didn't review the code, And then there's just the other alternative is that like people make mistakes. And so if the researcher made a mistake and then someone, pointed it out and then they did the proper thing and they retracted it and they'll fix it, that's the best thing we can do. We shouldn't sort of put down people because they make a mistake. We should just do the right thing and fix it.
Yeah, well, and I'll look up the specific story, but the backlash was pretty hard. It was even national press and stuff like that. So that was definitely, I think, putting people off from doing stuff like sharing their code. It's not really a good
yeah. And it's really unfortunate because there's probably so many examples out there where there's really good code and it gets published and there's a cool study and nobody said, the press isn't really going to jump on that. But the second that one person screws up, you can bet that the way our media works is that they'll just like jump on it. So it's also sort of a little bit of a bias in that way.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, I see some other questions as well. So if people want to raise those, Maxine, for example.
Yeah, do people want to jump in and just ask, or do you want me to look in some chat somewhere?
No, we
sure,
can let them unmute. Yeah.
Sure, I can ask. So this is something that is the case over here in Quebec and in at least one other province in Canada. The term engineer is actually protected. So you're only allowed to call yourself an engineer if you studied in some specific diplomas and you're a member of a big engineer association. Have you encountered any pushback about calling the association a research software engineer?
Yeah, so I know of that too. And I would suspect, I don't think there's pushback in the US or other countries. I've only heard that with Canada. And, I think it kind of trickles back to like when they started the movement in the UK, like they didn't really look across the world and be like, is this going to be a problem, this name in any other countries? What I think probably needs to happen is at least for Canada, they'll need to come up with a slightly different title, like, I don't know, research software developer or something that fits those rules. And then hopefully the international community will recognize that and kind of not totally change the name, but be more flexible to having these different titles.
Do you see any other questions, Simon?
I'll just, on the engineer thing, I guess this really depends on who you ask, but I also feel weird saying that I'm some flavor of engineer. When I think of an engineer, I think of like an electrical engineer, someone that works on trains, someone that has like an actual certification. And I'm sort of like, oh, I stumbled along into this. So I definitely see that as a kind of a cultural issue. But I think that issue existed before, research software engineers. It exists just with the title of software engineer.
Do you think there's also a factor that basically acted as a trigger for the RSE movement where, there's definitely a shift towards scientific computing, so computational modeling and simulation and all of that even more than before, like bioinformatics, and there's a couple of fields that have really grown there. Do you think that was a trigger for actually having people that work on research software and make it installable, make it fast? Like the growth of scientific domains playing around with these big computers, was that a factor as well? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that would be a factor because the need for RSEs is driven by the need to do good science. And if the need to do good science is driven by like all these different groups that are coming up with new workflow tools and that sort of thing. I guess, this is my personal opinion. I would say it's sort of a multifactorial thing. So that was happening, but at the same time, if there's the push for these roles, but you're in that role and like, you have a weird title and you don't have job security and you're like living grant to grant. I think that cultural piece is really what brought those original people together. Like, oh my goodness, we need to do something about this.
Mm-hmm. Okay, do we have any other questions? I think it's a great talk, by the way. It's a really good story, and you're clearly very enthusiastic about this. There's a big difference between the previous talks we've had, which are more laid back, or I don't know how I want to call them, but we should have more talks like this.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I definitely enjoyed giving it. It's nice to see other people during the Corona apocalypse.
Okay. Yeah. If there's no other questions popping up, maybe Simon, did you spot any? Otherwise, I guess we can wrap up.
I'm not seeing any. So again, thanks to Vanessa. And we will see everybody again tomorrow afternoon, or tomorrow morning for those in different parts of the world.
Thanks a lot, Vanessa.
Thanks, Kenneth.